The void between stars held no mercy, and Commander Zefka of the Kethvar Dominion preferred it that way. His crimson eyes scanned a tactical display aboard the flagship Annihilator's Pride, watching as 300 warships moved in perfect formation through the darkness. Each vessel bristled with weapons capable of reducing planets to molten slag, their hulls scarred by countless victories over lesser species. "Contact detected, Commander," reported his tactical officer, her blue-scale fingers dancing across holographic controls. "Single vessel, bearing to 7 Mark IV. Configuration unknown." Zefka's mandibles clicked in amusement. After 40 years of conquest, after watching 17 different civilizations burn, he'd learned that every species believed themselves special right up until the moment they died. The display shifted, revealing a lone ship drifting the cosmic wasteland like a metal splinter against infinity. "Magnify," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never known defeat. The image expanded, and Zefka felt his first flicker of curiosity in decades. The vessel was unlike anything in the Dominion's databases. Angular where Kethvar ships were curved, utilitarian where theirs were ornate, it possessed a brutal elegance that spoke of function over form. Weapon ports dotted its hull like black eyes, and strange symbols were etched into its armor plating. "Analysis," Zefka demanded. "Primitive fusion drive, basic energy shields, conventional projectile weapons," the tactical officer reported. "No match for even our smallest corvette. Shall I order the fleet to—" "Wait!" Something about the alien ship nagged at him. In 4 decades of slaughter, he developed an instinct for danger, and this vessel radiated it despite its apparent technological inferiority. "Attempt communication." The communications officer's head spines flared with confusion, but she complied. Static filled the bridge before clearing into an alien voice, speaking in harsh, guttural tones that the universal translator struggled to parse. "This is Captain Elena Rodriguez of the United Earthship Defiance. You are entering human space without permission. State your intentions." The bridge fell silent. Zefka had heard that tone before, not in the pleading of prey, but in the growl of predators defending their territory. Still, 1 ship against 300 was suicide by any calculation. "I am Commander Zefka of the Kethvar Dominion," he replied, his words transmitted across the void. "You will surrender immediately or be destroyed. There is no negotiation." A pause, then bitter laughter crackling through the speakers. "Commander, you're speaking to someone who lived through the Purge Wars. Negotiation went out the airlock a long time ago." Zefka's tactical display showed the human ship powering up its weapons. Pathetic energy readings compared to Kethvar technology, but the gesture was unmistakably defiant. He'd seen this before. The last desperate stand of a dying species, all sound and fury signifying nothing. Purge Wars. Zefka found himself asking, though he wasn't sure why. "When we decided that anyone different from us needed to die," came the cold reply. "Took us 40 years to remember what mercy looked like. But that was a long time ago, and we've had plenty of practice at killing since then." The human ship began moving, not fleeing but positioning itself between the Kethvar fleet and something behind it. Zefka's sensors detected it now, a small space station, clearly civilian, with minimal defenses and life signs numbering in the hundreds of thousands. "You defend the station you cannot possibly save," Zefka observed. "Why throw away your life for the inevitable?" "Because someone has to," Rodriguez replied simply. "And because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while monsters like you burn worlds." The words hit harder than they should have. Monsters. Zephyr had been called many things by dying species: conqueror, destroyer, death itself. But never monster. Monsters were mindless beasts. He was bringing order to chaos, strength to weakness, purpose to meaningless existence. "You know nothing of our purpose," he snarled. "I know you're about to murder 500,000 civilians," Rodriguez shot back. "I know you've done it before. And I know that makes you exactly what my species was during our darkest hour. Murderers who convinced themselves they were heroes." Zefka's claws scraped against his command throne. How dare this primitive alien compare the glorious Dominion to whatever sordid history her species carried? Yet something in her voice, A weary certainty that spoke of personal experience with atrocity made his certainty waver for the first time in decades. Last warning, human. Stand down or be obliterated. Counteroffer, Rodriguez replied, and Zefka could hear the smile in her voice, not pleasant, but sharp as broken glass. Turn around and leave, while you still can. The sheer audacity of it left the bridge speechless. One ship, threatening 300, one human, facing down the might of the Dominion, as if she held cards they couldn't see. Zefka looked at his tactical display, at the overwhelming firepower under his command, then at the lone human ship, holding position like a guardian angel with broken wings. Rodriguez was either insane, suicidal, or knew something he didn't. Fire, he ordered quietly. The Kefvar fleet opened fire with the concentrated fury of a small star. Energy beams that could melt asteroids converged on a human ship, followed by torpedo salvos that had reduced entire space stations to debris. The void lit up with destructive brilliance as 300 warships unleashed their full power on a single target. When the light faded, the UES Defiance hung in space, scarred but intact. Her shields flickered and sparked, her hull bore fresh wounds, but she remained defiantly operational. Impossible readings flooded Zefka's tactical display. The human ship should have been vapor, yet somehow she weathered a barrage that would have destroyed a Kefvar dreadnought. How? Whispered his tactical officer, her scales pale with shock. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communications array, steady despite the punishment her ship had endured. Reactive armor, adaptive shielding, and 40 years of learning how to take a beating. We got good at surviving after we stopped trying to be the bullies. Zefka stared at the display, his certainty cracking like ice under pressure. The human technology wasn't primitive. It was evolutionary, designed by a species that had clearly spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. But how had they known? Impossible, he muttered. Our intelligence indicated your species had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. Your intelligence was based on what we wanted you to know, Rodriguez replied. Funny thing about surviving genocide attempts. It teaches you the value of keeping some cards hidden. The human ship fired its weapons, and Zefka's confidence shattered completely. What emerged from the Defiance weren't the primitive projectiles his sensors had detected, but streams of accelerated matter moving at significant fractions of light speed. The kinetic rounds punched through 3 Kefvar destroyers like they were made of paper, their hulls vaporizing on impact. Evasive maneuvers. Zefka roared, but was too late. More rounds found their targets, and ships that had terrorized a dozen star systems died in brilliant explosions that lit the darkness like funeral pyres. Railguns, Rodriguez explained conversationally as another salvo reduced a Kefvar cruiser to expanding plasma. We found them more reliable than energy weapons. Harder to defend against, too. You can't jam a chunk of tungsten moving at 30% of light speed. The fleet scattered, their perfect formation dissolving into chaos as captains who'd never faced real resistance suddenly found themselves outgunned by technology they'd dismissed as obsolete. Zefka watched his tactical display transform from a picture of overwhelming superiority to a battlefield where death came without warning from impossible angles. "How many ships have you destroyed?" he demanded, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. "Counting today?" "None that mattered," Rodriguez replied, and there was something infinitely sad in her tone. "But during the Purge Wars, I stopped counting after the first 100, learned to stop caring after the first 1,000. The words hung in the void like an accusation. Zefka had destroyed 17 civilizations, had watched billions die, and felt nothing but satisfaction at bringing order to chaos. But this human spoke of her kills with the weary resignation of someone who'd lost her soul in the process. "You're a monster," he whispered, and realized he was looking in a mirror. "Yeah," Rodriguez agreed quietly. We all were. When fear makes you desperate enough, when survival becomes the only thing that matters, you'll justify anything. Sound familiar? Another salvo from the Defiance claimed 2 more Kefvar ships, but this time the destruction felt different to Zefka. Not glorious conquest, but simple butchery. The same butchery he'd been practicing for 4 decades, dressed up in noble rhetoric about bringing order to the galaxy. "The difference," Rodriguez continued, her ship weaving between return fire with impossible grace, is that we stopped. When the smoke cleared and we saw what we become, we made a choice. We could keep being monsters, or we could try to be something better. By hiding, by pretending to be weak, Zefka's claws dug into his command throne. By learning when not to fight, Rodriguez corrected. By understanding that strength isn't about how much you can destroy, but about what you choose to protect. My ship could have opened fire the moment you entered the system. Could have taken out half your fleet before you knew we were here. The admission hit Zefka like a physical blow. His sensors showed the human ship's true capabilities now. Stealth systems that had hidden her presence. Weapons that could have devastated his fleet from ambush. Technology that made the Kethvar Dominion look like children playing with toys. "Why didn't you?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Because killing you wouldn't have changed what you are," Rodriguez replied. "It would just have made us what we used to be. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't pulling the trigger. It's choosing not to." Around them, the battle raged on, but something fundamental had shifted. Zefka no longer saw a glorious conquest or even a worthy opponent. He saw himself reflected in the words of someone who'd walked the same path he'd been traveling, and found it led only to darkness. "What do you want from us?" he whispered. "The same thing someone wanted from us 40 years ago," Rodriguez said softly. "A chance to choose something different." The Kethvar fleet hung motionless in space, their weapons powered down but ready. Around them, the debris of their fallen comrades drifted like metallic snow, a testament to the human ship's devastating efficiency. Commander Zefka stared at his tactical display, watching a lone vessel that had shattered his worldview in the span of minutes. "You speak of choices," he said finally, his voice hollow. "But you don't understand what we are. The Kethvar were born in fire, forged by conquest. We know no other way." Captain Rodriguez's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter wisdom of hard experience. "That's what we told ourselves, too. Humans are naturally violent," we said. "It's just our nature to fight." Turned out that was just an excuse to avoid the hard work of being better. On the tactical display, Zefka could see the human space station they'd come to destroy. Hundreds of thousands of lives, going about their daily routines, unaware that their existence hung in the balance of a conversation between killers. He destroyed so many such places, had watched the light fade from countless worlds, and felt nothing but professional satisfaction. Now, for the first time in decades, he felt something else. Shame. "The Purge Wars," he said slowly. "Tell me about them." Silence stretched across the void before Rodriguez spoke, her voice carrying the weight of old wounds. "Started like they always do. Economic collapse, resource scarcity, someone to blame. The Mars colonies rebelled, declared independence. Earth couldn't let them go. Too much invested, too much pride. What began as politics became ideology. Ideology became hatred, and hatred became something darker." Zefka's tactical officer shifted uncomfortably at her station. The bridge crew had never heard their commander engage in philosophical discussion with prey before. But these humans had proven they weren't prey, and the conversation felt like standing at the edge of an abyss, staring into depths that might swallow them whole. "How many died?" Zefka asked, though he feared the answer. 12 billion in the first phase, Rodriguez replied matter-of-factly. "Another 8 billion when we glassed the outer colonies. The Jovian Confederation lasted longest. Took 3 years to crack their orbital defenses. When we finally breached them, we didn't just destroy their military. We destroyed everything. Men, women, children, their entire culture. We told ourselves it was necessary for peace." The numbers hung in space between them like accusations. Zefka had destroyed 17 civilizations, but even his most thorough campaigns had left survivors, refugees who could carry on their species' legacy elsewhere. The humans had been more thorough, more complete in their destruction. 20 billion of your own kind, he whispered, not counting the ones who died in the resource wars that followed. Rodriguez confirmed. Or the plague outbreaks when our medical infrastructure collapsed. Or the billions more who simply gave up. When you teach an entire species that life has no value, they start to believe you. Zefka's claws scraped against metal as his hands clenched involuntarily. He'd always prided himself on the Dominion's efficiency, their ability to conquer without waste. But the humans had achieved something he'd never imagined possible. They'd nearly driven themselves extinct through sheer brutality. How did you survive? How did you come back from that? We didn't, not all of us. Rodriguez's voice grew distant, memories pulling her back across decades of pain. I was a fighter pilot then, 23 years old, and convinced I was saving humanity by burning it down. Shot down over Europa. Spent 6 months in a refugee camp, watching children starve while we debated whether feeding them would encourage weakness. The image formed unbidden in Zefka's mind. A young human warrior, like so many of his own officers, certain of her righteousness and blind to her atrocities. It was a mirror he didn't want to look into. What changed? A little girl named Maria, Rodriguez said simply. 7 years old, parents dead in the bombardment of Ceres Station. She shared her last food ration with me, said her mother had taught her that helping others was what made people human. She died 3 days later. Malnutrition, treatable with medicine we had stockpiled for military use only. The silence that followed stretched like a wound. Zefka could hear his own breathing, the subtle hum of ship systems, the distant whisper of stars being born and dying in the cosmic dark. But mostly he heard the weight of choices made and unmade, of paths taken and rejected. That's when you stop fighting? That's when I started fighting for something instead of against everything, Rodriguez corrected. Took years to convince enough people, decades to rebuild what we destroyed. Some wounds never heal completely, but we learned that the opposite of war isn't peace. It's the choice to value life over victory. Zefka looked around his bridge, at officers who'd served him faithfully through decades of conquest. They'd followed him because he was strong, because he won, because he offered them purpose in a universe that seemed to have none. But what if that purpose was built on the same lie the humans had believed? The station, he said, nodding toward the civilian habitat his fleet had come to destroy. How many lives? 537,000. For 112, Rodriguez replied without hesitation, including about 50,000 children, mostly miners and their families, working the asteroid belt. They're not soldiers, not a threat to anyone, just people trying to build something instead of destroying it. The precision of her answer hit him like a physical blow. She knew exactly how many lives hung in the balance, valued each one enough to count them. When had he stopped counting? When had the death of billions become just numbers on a tactical display? You would die for them, he observed. I'd live for them, Rodriguez corrected. That's harder. The human ship hung in space like a steel prayer, her scarred hull catching starlight in ways that made her look both ancient and eternal. Around her, the Kethvar fleet maintained their positions, but something fundamental had shifted in the cosmic balance. Commander Zefka found himself staring not at an enemy, but at a possibility he'd never imagined. Show me, he said suddenly. Show me what you built after the wars. Captain Rodriguez's image appeared on his main display. A middle-aged human woman with gray threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of too many difficult decisions. But those eyes held something Zefka had never seen in his own reflection, hope tempered by wisdom. Computer, transmit file package Delta 7, Rodriguez ordered, and Zefka's screens filled with images that defied everything he thought he knew about conquest and civilization. Cities that spiraled toward the sky like living things, their architecture flowing organically from asteroid rock and recycled starship hulls. Gardens that bloomed in the void, enclosed in transparent domes that caught and magnified every precious photon of distant suns. Children of a dozen different human ethnicities playing together in zero-gravity playgrounds, their laughter crossing the communications channel like music. New Geneva Station, Rodriguez explained as the images shifted, built from the wreckage of 3 destroyed colonies. Population, per million. Crime rate, virtually 0. They grow enough food to feed themselves and 6 other settlements. They've never known war. Zefka's tactical officer leaned forward, her scales shimmering with something that might have been wonder. How is this possible? Our projections show that post-conflict societies invariably collapse within a generation. Because your projections assume that destruction is a natural state, Rodriguez replied gently. We learn that building something is harder than tearing it down, but the results last longer. These people aren't strong because they've conquered others. They're strong because they've learned to conquer themselves. More images flowed across the display. Massive ships not designed for war but for exploration, their hulls marked with symbols of peace rather than conquest. Scientists working alongside engineers to terraform dead worlds. Artists creating beauty from the ashes of old hatreds. The memorial worlds, Rodriguez continued, her voice growing soft. 7 planets we keep as monuments to what we lost. No one live there now, but we tend them, keep the ruins preserved. Every child in human space visits them once, learns what happens when fear becomes policy. Zefka felt something crack inside his chest. You preserve your failures? We preserve our lessons, Rodriguez corrected, because forgetting is how it happens again. The images showed vast museums built into bones of dead cities, their halls filled with holographic recreations of the lives lost in humanity's civil war. Names scrolled endlessly on obsidian walls. 20 billion individuals, each one remembered, each one mourned. We spent longer learning to remember than we did learning to forget, Rodriguez said. Every Kethvar you've killed, every world you've destroyed. Do you remember their names? The question hit like a physical blow. Names? Zefka could barely remember the names of the star systems he conquered, let alone the individuals who died in them. The Kethvar were efficient in their record-keeping, but they recorded only strategic values. Resources gained, resistance eliminated, territory secured. We remember efficiency, he said weakly. We used to, Rodriguez nodded, called it acceptable losses and strategic necessities. Turned people into numbers so we could process their deaths without guilt. But numbers don't scream when they die, and they don't leave families behind. Another image. A vast space station built in the shape of a spiral, its arms stretching across kilometers of void. But this wasn't military installation. It was a school, its corridors filled with beings that Zefka didn't recognize. Tall, crystalline entities worked alongside small, furry creatures. Aquatic beings in environment suits collaborated with energy patterns that seemed to exist as pure light. The University of Second Chances, Rodriguez explained. We found other species like us, ones who made the same mistakes, learned the same hard lessons. Turns out the galaxy is full of civilizations that nearly destroyed themselves and chose differently. Zefka's worldview crumbled further with each image. He believed the Kethvar were unique in their strength, destined to bring order to a chaotic universe. But here was evidence of dozens of species who found strength not in conquest, but in cooperation, not in dominance, but in diversity. How many, he whispered. 43 species in the Second Chance Coalition, Rodriguez replied. Each one a former warrior culture that chose to become something else. The Vektai were conquerors for 3,000 years before they discovered art. The Mollusk Collective spent millennia in civil war before they learned philosophy. The Crystalline Accord nearly shattered their entire dimension with temporal weapons before they chose pacifism. The implications staggered him. Not only were the humans not alone in their transformation, but they'd found others, built something larger than any empire through cooperation rather than conquest. The Kethvar Dominion, for all its military might, suddenly seemed small and isolated. And you would welcome us? Zefka asked, hardly daring to believe it possible. Rodriguez studied him through the display, her eyes weighing something he couldn't identify. The question isn't whether we'd welcome you, Commander. The question is whether you're ready to welcome the hardest thing any warrior culture can face, which is peace, she said simply. Not the peace of the grave or the peace of surrender, but the peace of choice. The peace that comes from deciding that your strength doesn't have to come from someone else's weakness. Zefka looked around his bridge at officers who followed him through 4 decades of conquest and saw his own uncertainty reflected in their faces. They were warriors, bred for battle, trained for victory. What would they become without enemies to fight? And if we choose war, he asked, though the question felt hollow now, then you'll win, Rodriguez said matter-of-factly. You'll destroy this station, kill 500,000 people, and continue your expansion until you meet something stronger than you are. Because there's always something stronger, always someone meaner, always a bigger monster waiting in the dark. The universe is vast enough to swallow all of us. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. But if you choose differently, if you decide that 40 years of killing is enough, then maybe you'll discover what we did. That the strongest thing you can ever be is someone who chooses mercy when they have the power to choose cruelty. The silence stretched across the void like a held breath. 300 Kethvar warships hanging motionless as their crews processed possibilities they'd never imagined. Commander Zethka stared at the tactical display, where the lone human ship waited. Her weapons powered down but ready, her captain's words echoing in the darkness between stars. "Stand down," he said quietly. His tactical officer's head spines flared in confusion. "Commander?" I said, "Stand down." Zethka's voice carried the authority of 40 years of command, but now it held something else. Uncertainty tempered by hope. Power down all weapons. Signal the fleet. No hostile action, without my direct order. The bridge fell silent, except for the soft whisper of environmental systems and the distant hum of the ship's reactor. Through the viewports, the civilian station continued its slow rotation, its lights twinkling like captured stars. 500,000 lives, going about their daily routines, unaware that their continued existence had just become an act of faith rather than a tactical calculation. "Captain Rodriguez," Zethka said, his voice carrying across the infinite dark, "if we were to consider your coalition, what would be required of U.S.?" The human's laugh was warm, carrying relief and something that might have been pride. "The hardest thing you've ever done, Commander. The hardest thing any of us have ever done. Which is admitting we were wrong." The words hung in space like a challenge. Zethka had built his entire identity around being right. Right about strength, right about order, right about the necessity of conquest. The Kethvar Dominion existed because he'd been right about their superiority over lesser species. To admit error would be to question everything. But looking at the images Rodriguez had shown him, seeing the civilizations that had found strength in cooperation rather than conquest, he wondered if being right was worth being alone. "The process," Rodriguez continued, "starts with truth, full disclosure of every world conquered, every species eliminated, every choice made in the name of order. The coalition maintains archives, not for punishment but for memory, so we never forget the cost of our old ways." Zethka's tactical officer shifted uncomfortably. "Commander, such records could be used against us." "By whom?" Rodriguez asked gently. "The coalition doesn't wage war on its members' past crimes. We've all committed them. The Vecti exterminated 12 species before they discovered art could express strength without violence. The Mallas Collective spent 3,000 years in civil war before they learned that cooperation was more efficient than competition." She paused, and her next words carried the weight of personal experience. "I personally killed over 2 million people during the Purge Wars. Shot them, bombed them, ordered their deaths from command positions. The coalition knows this. They welcome me anyway, because the person who committed those crimes isn't the person I chose to become." The admission hit Zethka like a physical blow. 2 million. The number dwarfed his own personal kill count. Yet this human spoke of it not with pride, but with a quiet acceptance of someone who'd learned to carry the weight without letting it crush her. "Redemption," he whispered. "Responsibility," Rodriguez corrected. "Redemption is something you earn through action, not words. The coalition will provide guidance, resources, and most importantly, oversight. Independent monitors to ensure that old habits don't resurface when things get difficult." Zethka's command staff exchanged glances heavy with meaning. Oversight meant accountability, the end of absolute authority. For warriors bred to command, it would be the ultimate surrender. "And our ships?" asked his weapons officer. "Our military capability?" "Repurposed," Rodriguez replied. "The galaxy is vast and dangerous. There are stellar phenomena that threaten inhabited worlds, asteroid impacts to prevent, failed colonies to evacuate, real threats that require real strength to face. Your ships would have purpose, just not the purpose of conquest." The idea was revolutionary. The Kethvar fleet, instruments of destruction for 4 decades, transformed into instruments of protection. It was either the ultimate redemption or the ultimate humiliation, depending on perspective. There would be resistance, Zethkar admitted. Many of my commanders have known no other way. Some would see this as betrayal of everything we are. Some of ours did too, Rodriguez nodded. The transition isn't easy. The Coalition provides support, counseling, retraining, new purpose for old warriors. But it has to be a choice, Commander. No one can be forced to change. They have to want it. Zethkar closed his eyes, seeing 40 years of conquest stretch behind him like a river of blood. 17 civilizations, billions of lives, entire cultures erased from existence because he believed strength meant dominance. The weight of it threatened to crush him. But for the first time in decades, he also saw another path forward. If I order the fleet to stand down, he said slowly, if I choose this path you offer, what guarantee do I have that it will work? That we can become something other than what we are? Rodriguez smiled, and in that expression Zethkar saw something he'd never expected to find in the face of an enemy. Compassion. None, she said simply. That's what makes it brave. The moments stretched between them, balanced on the edge of history. Around the Kethvar fleet, space held its breath, waiting for a decision that would echo across the galaxy. Fleet command, Zethkar said finally, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. Stand down from alert status. Signal all ships. We are not attacking the station. Repeat, we are not attacking the station. The acknowledgments came slowly. Confused voices of captains who'd never received such an order. But discipline held, and one by one, 300 warships powered down their weapons and began the long journey toward becoming something other than instruments of death. Captain Rodriguez, Zethkar said, and found his voice thick with emotions he'd thought long dead. On behalf of the Kethvar Dominion, I formally request guidance. Help us become what we should have been. The human ship's running lights flickered in what might have been a salute, and Rodriguez's voice carried across the void with the warmth of welcome rather than the chill of victory. Welcome to your second chance, Commander. Let's see what we can build together. In the darkness between stars, where mercy had met monstrosity and chosen compassion, the first seeds of transformation took root. It would be a long journey, fraught with difficulty and setback, but for the first time in 40 years, Commander Zethkar looked toward a future that didn't require anyone to die. And in that choice, both human and Kethvar discovered that the strongest force in the universe wasn't the power to destroy, but the courage to begin again,